Today we're talking about framing devices and how they can be used to present views, but also inform opinions of the audience, and more importantly, how they actually manage to do this.
How did you even do this?
A dollop of fairy dust.
On every single day, head a different way. Never stay in place, don't care what they say, we gon' do it anyway. Always by my side, oh, we're living life right. Every night we just drive by, cruising high life, we're alive. Not just getting by, not just letting life pass right underneath the side, grab it real tight. Okay, every day is a new day.
My name is Splice, and today I wanted to talk to you about something in the media that is actually super rarely discussed, but is incredibly common because it's used everywhere, especially subconsciously. That's the power of framing devices specifically. This can be something as direct as the way you talk about a subject
suffering from mental illness
on TV, to something as subtle as a camera angle you're filming a person at, or a tweet that you're sending in the words that you use to frame the situation. An easy example of this is the reaction many fans have of their favorite celebrity or online personality once they actually meet them offline, IRL, without the use of framing devices. Is he often used, "You're taller than I thought," or "You're shorter than I expected."
I was expecting someone with your reputation to be a little older.
General Grievous, you're shorter than I expected.
And this is actually all part of how the shots are arranged in the process of filming something. Without personal context, you view the camera angle as true to your own height expectations. If the camera's angled down, for example, as it is with the Gigic on some of his early videos, it gives the impression that he's actually relatively short compared to many viewers. This leads to a lot of confusion for people when they meet him in real life and realize he's surprisingly tall. He's 5'7", which for them who meet him who are already 5'7", will think he's actually shorter than that, because on YouTube, his camera is angled down, which makes you perceive him as smaller. This can actually be coupled with a further framing device that leads to the confusion, which is that he works on YouTube. And the prevailing assumption when you look at a YouTube video is that people are more real and less constructed on YouTube, as though they're, actual people that you know. But if you see some of the larger shows like the Philip DeFranco Show, News Show, or even Draw with Jazza, you'd know that in fact, behind the scenes, the more and more you get to know them, you realize that there's a synthetic level of framing that is a little different. There's a constructed medium, a specific intended framing device that they use to portray the person in a favorable light with a certain level of transparency that isn't what you get in person. And you also probably notice a tendency on YouTube to have a straight on or angle to be looking down on the figure, which camera language and angles means an emotional stance of evenness to the audience. So a sense of superiority is more angled down, like you'd see in Gigik's videos. Or if you're framing up, that gives you the idea that they're looking down on you, which gives them a certain level of authority. You'll see this in films a lot to kind of convey who has the power in a certain situation. And it's also cropping up in general on certain YouTube channels that want to portray a certain level of competence. You'll see this in a lot of political shows, you'll see this in a lot of educational stuff where it's straight on, trying to come off as an equal, or you'll see it modern news, they tend to have a slightly angled up to them, so angled down. This is actually called the worm's eye perspective. Now, it's not always super aggressive and obvious like that, but if you are angled as though you're looking up at the character, you're going to subconsciously believe that they're taller than you, you're going to believe that they have more authority. It's a psychological sort of trigger that a lot of editors and a lot of filmmakers actually take advantage of and use to convey to the audience a certain level of respect or commonality between yourself and the subject that you're viewing. Like for myself, this is a relatively straight-on, level-to-the-eye shot, which gives you this idea that I'm telling you something that is absolutely transparent, which is why most people tend to believe YouTube videos more than they would, say, a news broadcaster on CNN or Fox News, because they, with those larger shows that are more on syndicated television, they will sort of assume is a certain grain of salt to a lot of what is being said by these professional newscasters, whereas on YouTube, there's a certain level of personal trust and personal grassroots appeal that you tend to see on it. And a lot of that comes down to how they frame their shots, as well as where they're actually submitting their content out to, so you get a different sort of appeal and a different audience, and they take things in differently, which is why it's framed differently. For example, my more cinematic lighting, because that's just what I was taught in film school, tends to not be necessarily exactly what you'd want for a YouTube audience, because they tend to have a less cinematic appreciation and more of a, I want to just get the information from the audience. Now, what this does practically is make the presenter or character seem much more relatable and trustworthy when you have a straight-on shot. Now, with YouTube and its social mechanics at least touched on, let's tittle to some other framing devices in the media that trick your mind. First, let's talk about the least controversial of topics, news broadcasts. These shows are often actually presented in the opposite pairing framework of YouTube, because it's either shot straight on or from a slightly lower angle to give the audience the impression of some degree of authority on the topic, and that is why it's more of a one-sided discussion. They're actually talking at you. These are simple examples of when the performer or person on camera is presented as aware of the viewer, but there are other ways in which this can be done in movies, documentaries, and other media, in order to convey an intent by the person or group behind it to give the audience an emotional connection in a certain way. This is where you often come across fear-mongering.
Masks are for the guilty. They're signifiers of shame and submission.
Or overly positive viewpoints.
Up next, she's starting college at age 12 and inspiring America,
Which deliberately oversimplify something in order to get the audience to adopt a particular viewpoint on the discussion or topic. So this is kind of the framing idea of basically the information that's included and the information that is left out is itself a framing device.
History is filled with liars. If he lives and we die, his truth becomes written and ours is lost. Shepard will be a hero, because all you need to change the world is one good lie and a river of blood.
And this is really easily seen in the way that documentaries frame a discussion, when it includes people with an emotional investment in the topic, and only includes aspects which portray their perspective in a positive light, and not in any kind of nuanced light. This allows documentaries taking actions like not including a scientist on a topic with a complex scientific element to it, that allows for more clear understanding or balance on the topic when they're removed, to present themselves in a favorable light, even when they really shouldn't have that favorable light, because the topic that they're trying to present is total BS. And that's something that I see cropping up a lot. There are some minor examples, but let's just generally review for now what we've covered so far. First, framing is how information and the presenter is presented. Then it is what is included versus not included in the media, text, or conversation. Because yes, this occurs in real life, where you're just sort of introduced to your friends. It's just sort of the selective inclusion of different things in conversation that you have with your friends, versus the idea of the three faces, where you have the idea of what you present to your friends, what you present to your family, and what you present to your working world, and also the self that you truly are. And that's kind of the three different separations, and that's three different forms of framing for how you change yourself for other people, how you change yourself for the work environment, and how you are truly. And that's selective inclusion, which has a few other things that often dictate what is and isn't included if someone is trying to demonstrate something in a favorable light. They'll include scenes that demonstrate this, and rarely, if ever, include scenes that portray them in anything but a sympathetic way. So they'll never sort of portray the opposite angle, because generally, if they look at the opposite angle, there is a issue of possible nuance seeking by the audience member, and if their perspective isn't necessarily rock solid, then it tends to have a problem of coming off like, oh shit, these people are incredibly biased. And unfortunately, this, derides their credibility. So to sort of avoid this, you often see what's adopted is called a straw man fallacy. And what this essentially just means is they prop up a version of the discussion that they're sort of defeating through their research and perspective and attitude. Now, this happens both ways. It doesn't matter what your political beliefs are. It doesn't matter what your beliefs are scientifically or non-scientifically or in any sort of capacity. It's literally just a form of marketing and how you present information in a way to kind of communicate your intent to the audience. So this could be a negative thing. It could be a positive thing. It could be scientific. What you'll notice is different with a lot of scientific presentations is that there's not a lot of heavy marketing to a lot of how they present things because it's not all that interesting and there's a lot of nuance and detail, so it can be a little bit boring for an audience who isn't highly invested in that particular thing. Quick examples of framing to generate intimidation, for example, is when hearing something typical for a gangster has been done and shrugging it off until you realize exactly who you intended to piss off is someone totally different than who you did piss off. And the revelation completely shifts the tone of the scene, which is reflected in the reaction of the character and the delivery of the line.
I heard you struck my son.
Yes, sir, I did.
Yeah, may I ask why?
Yeah, well, because he stole John Wick's car, sir, and killed his dog.
The example I just sort of badly described is actually how John Wick is portrayed in such an intimidating light because the gravity of that situation is displayed through camera angle, delivery of the line, and the fact that no explanation other than the delivery change of the line demonstrated to the audience that, oh crap, John Wick is a serious person that we should not be screwing around with because it's changed the mob boss, serious man, suddenly into a terrified sheep who cannot talk outside of one word. And that's pretty serious. To understand that, we only needed a few words, changing the character's behavior dramatically, and essentially out of character is serious business is the trope. And that ties in gravitas, performance, atmosphere, and musical guidance, which is the music behind that kind of subconsciously impacts how you think about stuff. And it demonstrates how serious the moment is, and it continues to be reinforced by the quiet, efficient, and meticulous manner in which the character is portrayed, down to his mannerisms and speech patterns.
John? Let us not resort to our baser instincts and handle this like civilized men to move on.
That is framing. An example of not including something is in documentaries frequently where they are attempting to argue a certain point without including a balanced selection of voices, because it would negatively impact the facts of their scenario and lessen the overall impact of the documentary. Now, this is done both in good and bad areas. This happens a lot. It ranges from Seaspiracy, which had a lot of negative nagging on certain places in a way that wasn't exactly representative of the facts and didn't necessarily take into account scientific nuance or deliberately misleading the audience. For example, the thing that was mentioned a lot, if you looked into kind of the counter arguments, was that they mentioned about the nets being a large issue, and if you look online, there was no evidence of that. Unfortunately, if you actually looked online and looked for what's called ghost nets, which the media never addressed, you actually find droves of information about it, so it's not quite accurate. Another example in Planet of the Humans is the idea that the world is completely gone to the birds. It's gone pear-shaped with climate change, and while that's totally accurate, the larger kind of concern is actually the presentation at the end of the film that the only way to really solve this issue is to essentially start some form of a culling or to essentially support the idea of eugenics, which scientifically is a really dicey topic that's not great.
Just to get you in on that question as well, I mean, it sounds a bit Malthusian, some of what you're suggesting here. Is that an inaccurate characterization? What's your response to that?
Absolutely. We never use the word population control. We're not in favor of population control. We merely point out, as there was a UN study that came out 1 or 2 years ago, that just points out that the doubling of our human numbers and the quadrupling of our human economy is the prime driver of extinction on this planet.
It's scientifically been debunked about 1,500 times. So I'm really not going to get into that, but basically there's a lot of good information in Planet of the Humans. There's a lot of good information in Seaspiracy, but there's a lot of bias that you have to be consciously aware of, or seek opposite opinions, or seek scientific critiques from, to get a more balanced understanding of the heavily nuanced topic. And of course, framing allows for a different perspective. That being said, mundane YouTube videos that only show statistics which show a certain picture without explaining the nuance of what those stats actually mean in detail. It's also frequently used in propaganda films to change the population's view on a topic by simply emphasizing the positive aspects of something without context or mention of the full picture. It's also used to communicate exactly how good things really need to be understood and why they're good, and to kind of elicit an emotion of action in the audience. Or it's kind of used, for example, with Game of Thrones to make everybody hate Joffrey and his guts. That was all set up by the character, his portrayal, and the framing that's used with him, and the interactions of those around him, which set up a particular level of generalized opinion of people around him, and the negative people that we didn't like thinking of him in a more favorable light, and the people we did like thinking of him in a less favorable light, which led to a overall negative opinion of the character. And that is framing, using outside aspects to continue to sort of inform the audience's opinion and change how they think of different characters. This is often how you have the modern twist ending in many movies and TV shows, as it's harder to predict a twist when the evidence is either non-existent or when the audience focuses on at the time and therefore can't predict is somewhere different. Framing is often used in all media and in real life, and they shape everything we know, from news to video games and more. We owe it to ourselves to know that nothing in its conception is unbiased, because in the media, it's always telling a story of some kind. With that, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, ring the bell, and comment down below for your favorite use of framing, and let me know what your favorite use of framing is that you know of. There's all kinds all over the place, so I'd love to hear what you think. This is where you get all kinds of different things like homage, which is kind of taking a framing from a different movie or a different thing that you liked and recreating it in another way and recontextualizing it for your own purposes, or for essentially taking something and renegotiating the meaning of it using the power of editing, which is why editors are so powerful in media, because in reality, they kind of change your perspective based on how they arrange images and videos in order, because that's how the human brain creates an image, and they're always creating a story, because psychologically, we need a story in order to feel a certain level of connected to whatever's being told to us. That's why statistics don't really ring so well with a lot of people, because if you're just being rattled off numbers and statistics, it's really not that interesting to listen to. Anyway, guys, that's just my thoughts. Thank you so much for listening to my extended rant. Anyway, and I hope you have a great rest of the day, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace. Splice out. First, let's talk about the least controversial topic of possibilities, news broadcasts. These shows are often No, stop, good. Come on.